November 11th, 1940. In the quiet black waters of Taranto Harbor, the Italian battle fleet lay motionless beneath a pale, drifting moon. 6 battleships, vast, steel leviathans rested in tidy rows, their hulls reflecting soft ripples from the lanterns on nearby docks. Sailors lounged on open decks. Anti-aircraft crews dozed in their posts. Officers walked slowly along the pier, their uniforms crisp, their voices low, confident that no enemy could touch them in these shallow, fortified waters. The harbor was ringed with torpedo nets and guarded by coastal guns, searchlights, and barrage balloons drifting overhead like gray ghosts. Italy believed this anchorage was invulnerable. The battleships Conte di Cavour, Caio Duilio, and Littorio lay at the center of this steel fortress, their guns silent, their crews unalerted. But high above the shimmering night, far out over the Mediterranean, a faint sound began to drift toward the coast, an engine hum so soft it could have been mistaken for the wind. The importance of Taranto could not be overstated. The Italian fleet held the central Mediterranean hostage. Convoys to Malta risked annihilation. Supply routes to Egypt were threatened daily. The British merchant navy felt the pressure of every Italian cruiser and battleship that prowled the sea. Taranto was the anchor of that power, the safe haven where Italy's armor slept. If the capital ships at Taranto remained intact, the British position in the Mediterranean could collapse. But if the battleships were crippled, Italian naval strength would evaporate overnight. Control of the entire theater hung on a harbor lit by the dim glow of lanterns and watched over by officers who still believed battleships ruled the world. That confidence came from more than numbers. Taranto had been reinforced for months. Torpedo nets stretched around every battleship, forming metal cocoons meant to catch any torpedo before it could strike home. Anti-aircraft guns were stationed on rooftops, piers, and ships. Searchlights ringed the coastline. The water itself was shallow, far too shallow, the Italians believed, for aerial torpedoes to function properly. Launching torpedoes in such confined depth would cause them to dig into the seabed or break apart on impact. This harbor, they insisted, was beyond the reach of aircraft. Their calculations supported their belief. Their history supported their confidence. But the attackers approaching Taranto that night had spent months defying calculations and rewriting those beliefs. British intelligence had studied Taranto obsessively since before the war even began. Analysts examined aerial photographs, naval blueprints, and water depth surveys. Officers drafted plans in dim war rooms across London, testing every possibility for a surprise attack. They had watched Italy's fleet gather strength for years, and as the strategic pressure mounted, a daring idea took form. It was simple, audacious, and unprecedented. Launch an all-night torpedo strike from an aircraft carrier, using a handful of antiquated biplanes to do what no navy had ever attempted. It would require perfect timing, flawless navigation, and machines capable of surviving the impossible. The Royal Navy found those machines in the unlikeliest aircraft ever designed for war. The British Swordfish was a relic, a slow-moving, fabric-winged biplane that belonged to another generation. It had open cockpits, fixed landing gear, and an engine that sputtered in crosswinds. But it also had unmatched stability at low speeds and low altitudes, perfect for night flight, perfect for silence, perfect for torpedo attacks in shallow waters. And in the hands of experienced naval aviators, the Swordfish became something extraordinary. Engineers modified its torpedoes with wooden fins to stabilize their descent. They added special shallowing gear to keep them from diving too deep upon release. They trained pilots to skim only a few meters above the waves, threading through enemy defenses by touch and instinct. What seemed like a primitive aircraft became a weapon perfectly suited for the raid that could break Italy's naval spine. As the sun set on November 11th, HMS Illustrious moved into position southwest of Taranto, her flight deck washed in red lights as Swordfish crews made their final preparations. Mechanics checked torpedo mounts. Pilots reviewed maps, illuminated only by dim lamps, memorizing silent approach routes carved through clouds and moonlit waves. The Mediterranean breeze rolled across the deck. The sea glowed faintly in the distance. Every man understood the stakes. If the strike failed, the Royal Navy would face Italy's battleships alone in open water. If it succeeded, the Mediterranean could be transformed in a single night. The pilots had trained for months for this exact moment. Now it was time. Swordfish engines coughed to life one by one, their propellers chopping the cool night air. Crews climbed aboard, strapping themselves into open cockpits with the wind tugging at their goggles. Lanterns were extinguished. The sea became a black mirror. The first wave of torpedo bombers crept into takeoff position. Their torpedo fins glistened faintly in the moonlight, each weapon capable of slicing a battleship open from beneath. The carrier turned into the wind. A final signal was given. The first swordfish lurched forward, bouncing along the deck before lifting gently into the darkness. One after another, the aircraft rose into the night sky, their silhouettes vanishing into clouds like ghosts. The approach to Taranto was long and perilous. The swordfish flew low, just above the waves, their engines throttled down to reduce sound. They drifted across patches of moonlight and shadow, following invisible paths marked by stars and instinct. Italian radar was primitive, unreliable, and poorly interpreted. The aircraft passed undetected across miles of open sea. The pilots described the sensation as flying into a wall of darkness, guided only by the faint glimmer of the coastline far ahead. They moved as a single flock, invisible, silent, determined. As they neared Taranto, the coastline emerged like a faint silver line beneath drifting clouds. Beyond it lay the harbor, calm and unsuspecting. The Italian fleet still rested in its defensive shell, searchlights pointed skyward but unmoving, torpedo nets glistening faintly in the moon's pale reflection. The harbor's stillness was matched only by the swordfish pilots' unwavering focus. Above them, the sky seemed to hold its breath. Below them, the sea whispered against the harbor walls. Everything was ready. The first swordfish of the lead wave peeled off and ascended slightly. The pilot pulled a flare canister and released it into the darkness. Seconds later, the flare burst open above the harbor, casting a blinding white glow across the battleships below. The entire anchorage lit up as if dawn had come at midnight. Every turret, every net, every mast stood out in shimmering detail. Italian lookouts froze. Officers stared upward in shock. For an instant, the harbor was frozen in perfect clarity, then alarms erupted across the waterfront. Anti-aircraft guns roared to life. Searchlights sliced through the sky. Machine guns rattled along the piers. But the swordfish pilots were already diving, their biplanes descending to mere meters above the water. Their wings cut through the glare of Italian searchlights, casting shadows that danced across battleship hulls. The pilots steadied themselves, gripping their control sticks as they began their torpedo runs. Conte di Cavour, the proud veteran of Italy's battle line, loomed directly ahead. Her crew scrambled to action stations, but the battleship's massive guns were useless against the tiny aircraft weaving through the fire. A swordfish skimmed across the water, its floats kicking up faint sprays of foam. The pilot locked onto the battleship's silhouette, lined up his shot, and released the torpedo at the perfect angle. The weapon slipped into the water with barely a splash, its wooden fins stabilizing its course as it ran straight toward the battleship's hull. Seconds later, a deep, muffled explosion erupted under Conte di Cavour's portside. The battleship lurched violently as water surged into her lower compartments. She was mortally wounded. As Conte di Cavour began to settle into the harbor floor, the remaining swordfish banked for their own attack runs, preparing to unleash chaos upon the rest of Italy's fleet. The night above Taranto had only just begun to burn. The second wave of swordfish entered Taranto just as the smoke from the first explosions drifted across the harbor like torn gray veils. Firelight flickered against the undersides of scattered clouds, and columns of seawater still rained down from the blast that had torn open Conte di Cavour. The Italian night had erupted into chaos, and yet the biplanes approached with the same slow, unwavering grace, their silhouettes barely visible against the sky. They flew so low, their wheels almost skimmed the water, gliding through the blinding beams of searchlights that clawed at the darkness. Their torpedoes hung from their bellies like silent promises. Ahead of them, the battleships Caio Duilio and Littorio loomed in the glowing haze, half shrouded by smoke, lit by the fire of burning warehouses and oil tanks. Italian anti-aircraft crews fired wildly, dozens of guns competing to fill the harbor with steel. But the Swordfish came on, small and steady, unfazed by the violence blooming around them. Where the first wave had struck with surprise, the second wave struck with precision. One Swordfish peeled off and dove toward Caio Duilio, its engine growling against the rising wind. The pilot held the aircraft steady, letting tracer rounds whip past the wings like burning needles. The battleship's gunners tried desperately to adjust for the biplane's speed, but the Swordfish was too slow, too low, too irregular in its movement to predict. It swept across the waterline, descending until the torpedo almost skimmed the waves. Then, with a measured breath, the pilot released his weapon. The torpedo struck the water perfectly, its wake racing across the harbor in a faint white line. Italian sailors shouted warnings from Caio Duilio's deck as they spotted the thin trail approaching through the glow of floodlights. Seconds later, the torpedo detonated beneath the battleship's starboard side. The explosion rocked the vessel violently, tearing open boiler rooms and flooding storage compartments. The battleship began to list. Damaged crews sprinted below deck, but the sea poured in too quickly. Within minutes, Caio Duilio was forced to beach herself near the inner harbor to avoid sinking completely. Littorio, the newest and most modern of Italy's battleships, was now the primary target. She had been designed to dominate the Mediterranean, her engines powerful, her armor resilient, her guns capable of outranging most adversaries. Now she sat at anchor, a giant trying to awaken while fire and smoke enveloped her. The Swordfish pilots knew her importance. If Littorio remained operational, Italy could still threaten British convoys. If she fell, Italian naval power would collapse. A Swordfish descended toward her using the glare of burning warehouses as cover. Anti-aircraft bursts exploded all around the biplane, flinging shards of metal into the night sky, but the Swordfish flew straight through the chaos, dipping low across the water. The pilot lined up his angle, compensating for wind and smoke, watching the enormous shape of Littorio rise through the glare. He released his torpedo. It plunged into the water and streaked toward its target. Moments later, a deep explosion burst beneath the battleship's bow. The impact tore open compartments near the anchor machinery and sent shockwaves through the hull. Littorio reeled from the hit, settling deeper into the harbor. But the night was not finished with her. A second Swordfish swept in low from the northwest, dropping another torpedo that struck near her stern. A third aircraft followed, targeting her midsection. Littorio shook under the rapid succession of detonations. Fires ignited along her superstructure. Water flooded into her lower decks. Her crew struggled to contain the damage, but the torpedo strikes crippled her propulsion systems and left her immobilized in the harbor. As the battleships suffered under the assault, other Swordfish turned their attention to secondary targets. Bombs dropped from the biplanes rained onto seaplane hangars, fuel depots, and supply warehouses along the waterfront. Wooden structures erupted into violent flame, turning the harbor into a blazing ring of fire. Oil tanks burst open, spilling burning liquid across the water. The glow illuminated the entire city of Taranto, casting long shadows of cranes, ships, and smoke across the trembling surface of the bay. Italian spotlights flickered as power stations overloaded. Emergency sirens screamed across the city. But through it all, the Swordfish kept flying, weaving between flak bursts and tracer lines with uncanny agility, as if the chaos of the night belonged to them. Italian command struggled to form a coherent response. Officers rushed from barricades to telephone stations, shouting orders that never reached the guns in time. Torpedo nets were tangled or misaligned from earlier impacts. Floodlights were blinded by smoke. Barrage balloons hung uselessly after their cables burned through. The defenses built carefully over years had been overwhelmed in less than an hour. The attack came from angles no one predicted. At altitudes, most anti-aircraft guns were not calibrated to reach, and using aircraft, many officers believed too slow to be a threat. The harbor, once considered the safest anchorage in the Mediterranean, was now a labyrinth of burning ships, drifting debris, and stunned sailors running across decks lit by flame. As the Swordfish completed their attack runs, they banked away from the blazing harbor, flying low across the water to escape the final bursts of anti-aircraft fire. Their pilots felt the heat of burning oil wash over their open cockpits as they passed. The sea below them shimmered orange and gold, reflecting the inferno that filled the harbor. Behind them, explosions continued to echo as ammunition stores ignited aboard damaged ships. But the biplanes climbed steadily into the night, leaving Taranto's ruins behind as they headed back toward HMS Illustrious. Some aircraft returned with bullet holes in their wings. Others dripped seawater from near misses. But the losses were astonishingly low. Nearly every aircraft made it home. Dawn revealed the full magnitude of the disaster. Smoke still drifted across Taranto Harbor in thin gray strands. The water near the battleships was stained with oil. Broken masts and shattered lifeboats floated in slow circles. On the harbor floor, the battleship Conte di Cavour lay partially submerged, her hull ruptured beyond immediate repair. Caio Duilio sat aground in shallow water, listing heavily, her engine rooms flooded. Littorio, her decks scorched and her hull torn open in multiple places, rested almost motionless, propped up only by emergency counterflooding. In a single night, more than half of Italy's battleship strength had been crippled. No Italian naval officer had believed such a result was possible. The strategic consequences rippled through the Mediterranean instantly. With its battle fleet shattered, Italy lost the ability to threaten British convoys effectively. Malta's lifeline reopened. The pressure on Alexandria eased. British naval forces maneuvered with greater confidence. Control of the sea began to shift. The Regia Marina, once touted as a major naval power, found itself crippled by the loss of so much tonnage in one night. Repairs on the damaged battleships would take months. Conte di Cavour would never return to active service. Taranto had changed the balance of the Mediterranean in a single hour. The shock traveled far beyond Italy. Naval observers across the world studied the aftermath with disbelief. Admirals who had once scoffed at the idea of aircraft sinking capital ships inside fortified harbors realized their age-old doctrines had collapsed overnight. Battleships anchored in shallow water were no longer safe. Torpedo nets and shore guns no longer offered security. The sky, not the sea, had become the new battlefield. For the first time in naval history, an aircraft carrier strike had crippled a battle fleet at anchor. This was not a theory or a test. It was proof. In the United States, naval strategists studied Taranto with intense interest. Reports, photographs, and analysis were sent to Pearl Harbor and Washington. The lesson was clear. Aircraft carriers were not support vessels. They were the new capital ships. Torpedo planes, even slow ones, could pierce defenses and decide battles in minutes. The strike on Taranto became required reading for officers studying modern naval warfare. It illuminated vulnerabilities that had never before been imagined. And in Tokyo, Admiral Yamamoto pored over the details of the attack with fascination. He saw in the British raid the blueprint for something greater. Taranto did not simply shock the world. It foretold the future. The legacy of Taranto reached far beyond the Mediterranean. It marked the end of an era in which battleships decided the fate of nations. It marked the rise of naval aviation as the dominant force at sea. And it proved that courage, planning, and innovation could overturn the most fortified defenses on Earth. Italy's fleet never recovered from the blow. Its battleships remained battered symbols of a doctrine that had been outpaced by time. In the end, the night sky over Taranto told the story. A handful of biplanes, slow, fabric-covered relics, had rewritten naval warfare in a single hour. They had slipped through darkness, flown into the heart of a fortified harbor, and crippled 3 battleships with precision that defied expectation. Taranto was not simply a battle, it was a transformation. It was the moment when aircraft seized control of the sea, and the age of the battleship began to fade into history. It was the night the Allies shattered Italy's battle fleet, and the world discovered that the greatest threat to a warship no longer came from the horizon, but from the sky.